Say that you don't want to be a meta sheep. How would your favorite rogue deck do in the current metagame? Could a deck like Blue Eyes stand up to the best decks of this format? These are the questions a lot of players ask, as Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not just about playing whatever the newest deck is, but playing the decks you have a connection with, the decks you've played for years as a kid, or you've seen someone else play in the anime, or even just decks that you enjoy. So for this tier list, we are not going to be just looking at what the best decks in the metagame are, rather what the best rogue decks are and how they match up into the current meta. So the way that we're going to be breaking down this tier list will be similar to the last one that I did. We're not going to be going at it from tier by tier, but rather we're going to look at decks in different categories. First, we're going to rank all of the favorite anime decks that people love to play. Next, we'll rank the past meta decks, ones that used to be the top dog but no longer are, and see how those still hold up. And then we'll rank the last 6 released structure decks, something that you guys recommended in my last video. Next, we'll rank all of the TCG exclusive archetypes over the last little bit. Then lastly, we'll rank some of the decks that have gotten some new support that I haven't yet ranked on my meta tier list video. And as always, each rank involves a couple different factors, including how consistent the deck is, how powerful it is, how much non-engine it can play, as well as how it matches up into the top dogs in the meta. Yu-Gi-Oh! Being an ecosystem, if a deck struggles against the best deck, which in this case would be either Rizal or Malice, then that only serves to hurt its chances of being good. So that's going to be a huge factor in how a deck's position may change on a tier list from the last one to this one, given many of these new decks have received 0 new support cards. And now before we get into the actual ranking, if you guys enjoy these tier lists, especially the ones that aren't traditional meta deck tier lists, please let me know by liking, subscribing, as well as commenting down below that it's worth my time doing, as well as anything else you want to see me rank in the future tier list. For example, the structure deck segment was not something I had last time, but I'm happy to include new things if it gets you guys invested. But now, let's rank some decks. So first up, we've got a fan favorite, Blue Eyes. A deck that was once renowned as being the best deck as it won the World Championship in 2016, and of course is Kaiba's very own deck. However, in recent years, it's gotten effectively no support, and we ranked it pretty low on the last tier list. Well, how have things changed in the few months since? Well, I think it has moved up slightly, and that's partially because even though the deck has not received any new cards directly, it has got the Primite package. Now, the Primite package will weigh heavily into this deck's ranking, as well as a couple other decks' ranking. If you guys aren't familiar, the Primite package is a suite of several different cards that directly support normal monsters, and they can be used with pretty much any. They are very powerful card quality that gives you a general constant flow of summoning monsters, as well as disruption, and it's just good. They're very strong cards, and they're only getting better with more releases coming out in the future. In a couple weeks from this video's release, for example, we're going to be getting the Primite Another Barrel Dragon, which just further increases the deck's power. With that being said, the deck didn't get that much of a boost to spike it up all the way to the top of the leaderboard. It gets an improvement, but not by much. It's not like the deck has any favorable matchups into Malice or into Rizal either. You could argue that Rizal can be okay because you can match the power level of Detonator, as well as the destruction effect of Detonator isn't always the worst for Blue Eyes deck, given that you have cards like Return of the Dragon Lords for protection. But your Malice matchup is kind of the opposite. Malice should just roll over Blue Eyes, and playing into a Malice field sounds almost impossible, as their ability to rip apart your grave and banish your field almost effortlessly makes Blue Eyes rather obsolete in that matchup. So even with the improvements, I think this deck struggles to break past anything higher than a C tier deck, which is an improvement from last time, albeit not much. However, this should be the last time we see this deck so low ranked, if not for a while, because in a few months we will be getting the Blue Eye structure deck with some real powerful support cards, and this deck's time to shine will come once again. Next up, we move on to Yugi's ace deck, Dark Magicians, a deck which last time I placed in C tier above Blue Eyes, and I think it's going to have a rather similar trend this time. I ranked it higher before because of its control aspects, and you could usually adapt it with its non-engine to beat whatever in the meta, and that hasn't really changed. That still exists now, as well as this deck did get support with the Primite cards, being able to summon Dark Magician endlessly. And I think that's even more important in this deck than it is in Blue Eyes, because Blue Eyes has like a million different monster reborns. Dark Magician doesn't actually have a million different ways of setting itself up. It is relied on cards like Souls, but Souls is a card which you'd rather summon via its own effect than send to the grave to summon Dark Magician. It also all lends itself well to Dark Magical Circle, which is the once per turn banish card. The Primite cards give you more access to trigger it aggressively and defensively to banish your opponent's field, which is actually really good in this metagame. If you guys want to see me play a Primite Dark Magician deck, then let me know, because it's something that I've been cooking for a while and I haven't had a chance to show it off yet. As well as Dark Magician also gets one last boost that I think Blue Eyes doesn't really get, and that is it gets to use Chaos Angel effectively. Chaos Angel right now seems to be like a incredibly powerful card. It's gone up in value a lot as it's very powerful to beat Rizal. Now, where Dark Magician cannot thrive is that Rizal Detonator does destroy face-up cards very well. So continuous spells like Dark Magical Circle, Primite Lord Reload, and Eternal Soul all will fall victim to Detonator. And while you can use your non-engine suite to control this, as you should be playing like a control deck, it's still going to mean your engine versus engine is sort of lacking in that regard, and that is concerning. Overall, though, I'm going to place this deck in the B tier because I do think it has gotten an upgrade, even if not a huge one. Now, next on, we got the Red Eyes deck. A deck which last time I placed in the D tier alongside Blue Eyes. Now, this deck has gotten new support with the Metamorph cards as well as the Primite cards. However, I think the Primite cards help this deck significantly less, as the boss monsters for Red Eyes, like Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, don't really need you to summon Red Eyes at all. And the XYZs in Red Eyes, like Black Metal Flare Dragon, kind of just suck. And there's not really a payoff for using the Primite cards that well in the Red Eyes deck. The reason would be to use Metamorph cards. Metamorph cards truthfully work better without actually playing Red Eyes and just playing a bunch of other cards instead. And where that leaves this deck is honestly kind of pathetically just in a worse position than its counterparts. The third leg of the trio of Dark Magician and Blue Eyes and Red Eyes, it's the worst. Sorry, Joey.
Well,
Before it was accompanying Blue Eyes in the D tier, I think Red Eyes is alone in the D tier this time. All for its lonesome. But now let's move on to the Metamorph deck. This fusion between Bandit Keith and Joey's monsters into the metal theme is one of the newer strategies released in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG. It's not proven itself on a competitive stage, but the effects are pretty good. Konami has done a good job of releasing new themes that have some sort of playability and viability. The effects of Metal Zoa X and Red Eyes Black Full Metal Dragon are both powerful, even though they are a little bit annoying to summon. And because you need to summon them from the deck, they've given them the ability to shuffle themselves from the hand back in the deck and not go neg in the process. That goes for a huge help for consistency for these type of decks, which otherwise would really struggle. Now, it would kind of make sense that this is a Red Eyes type deck with, Red Eyes Black Full Metal Dragon being one of the mainstays here, but in truth, the Red Eyes cards don't necessarily work well with the Full Metal cards because, well, you don't need to tribute Red Eyes. You need to tribute a high-level dragon. And guess what better high-level dragons there are? Bestials. And if you're looking for high-level fiends, Fiendsmith does it better than Zoa. So you can honestly play a Full Metal Bestial Fiendsmith deck, and it works pretty well. It's a deck I also have built, and I'm ready to play on the channel anytime. So if you guys want to see me play that deck, then comment down below and we'll do that as well. But I think this deck is pretty solid. So I'm going to put this deck, Metamorph, in the A tier. Next, let's move on to Exodia / the Millennium deck. And it's a bit weird to call this Exodia because in truth, it doesn't feel like a classic Exodia deck. Though it is, it's just its own unique way. Now this deck is very cool and it's something that I praised a lot in the last tier list and in other videos because I think its design mechanic is just so inspired and unique, as well as it's very splashful in other decks. However, I've talked about this in my last tier list video for the meta decks, and that is how Millennium kind of struggles right now. Detonator being the mainstay threat in the meta that your deck has to beat is a problem for Millennium because Detonator destroys, like absolutely rips apart continuous spells, and that is pretty much all that Millennium is. Now, the other problem with Millennium is always going to be the fact you have to play 5 pieces of Exodia in the deck. They are bricks, and unlike the Metamorph where you have ways of putting them back in your deck for an actual advantage, if you draw the Exodia pieces, you can use them, they don't do anything. And all that contributes to being a kind of bricky deck that can feel pretty shit. I've played this deck, and when you draw 2 Exodia pieces, you want to throw up. It just sucks. And then if you build upon the deck with any sort of other complementary engines to increase its power level, that just means more bricks to the deck. So while this deck has potential with a powerful boss monster, the Exodia fusion is crazy. It still leaves it rather lacking. And for now, I'm going to put this in the C tier as it's really fallen off for me in terms of power. Next up is Galaxy Eyes. And this is a deck that I got a little flack for ranking so lowly in the last video. And I'm sorry, because I didn't know the most about Galaxy Eyes back then. Hadn't very played it much, but on stream over the last few months, I have played this deck about 20 times or so. So I've got to learn it. My opinions have not changed. I think this deck sucks. I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to throw this in the F tier. Now, I can argue that maybe this should be on D tier with Red Eyes, but this deck just has a lot of the classic problems in Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks. Its combos can be kind of cool. However, the amount of disruptions it outputs is low with like 2 to 3 disruptions. So a lot of decks can power through it, which, is healthy, but not that good. Has good follow-up, which is nice. but what it lacks is it lacks the ability to play a lot of non-engine, so you can't break through fields so well. The deck is vulnerable, so it can be vulnerable to hand traps as well as your opponent's field. I don't know, it's not very good at pushing through things either from my discovery. So really the only thing it has going for it is the fact it can grind game well. If you're going to play a deck with a grind game, it shouldn't be acting like a combo deck, because that's what Galaxy Eyes does. It acts like a combo deck, but it does so in a weak fashion, in a vulnerable fashion, without the ability to back it up with non-engine. And for me, that's just the makings of a bad deck. It's weird because so many of the cards are pretty good that it is close to being better. Someone brought up in the last video that it's better because of the new cards in the OCG, but those aren't out here yet. But for now, I think this deck just doesn't deserve to be respected, so I'm going to throw this all in the bottom. Sorry if I've offended your best deck, but it's the truth, so deal with it. Next up is Synchrons, and this is a deck that somehow sees some play in Mashable, and I think this deck is horrible. It's the same thing I kind of went over last time. This deck's weakness to opposing disruption makes it very hard to play, and you may get some people off guard in Mashable being a best of one format, where you play cards like Black Witch to try and bait disruption, but in the best of 3 setting, when your opponents know you're playing Synchron, game 2 and 3 get that much harder. This deck's end board is kind of scary. Even with Baron Band and Savage Band, it kind of goes ham, and maybe I didn't give it enough credit in the last video, but I still think this deck is just overall very flawed. I can't go second very well. Going first, it's not great, and obviously now the Mulch armies, it's like Maxi exists here in the TCG. I think Synchron can like sit at D tier. I put it in F tier before, and maybe it belongs in F tier, but like, I don't know, D and F tier are pretty close to me in terms of lack of playability, and I'd steer away from these decks if I could. Moving on, we got Blackwing. Blackwing is another fan favorite that I think I forgot to go over last time, which I almost can't believe I forgot as a deck. You know, people love this deck for its synchro capabilities, as well as for the anime, as well as a nostalgia pick for players who played this back in Edison days. Now, me, myself, I haven't actually given the deck much of a chance to play, not at least in last years. I played like the original deck in 2010, 2009, etc., but it bears almost no resemblance to the modern deck. Right now, the modern deck plays like a crazy aggro combo deck, kind of like the Synchron deck. I think it is better than the Synchron deck as it plays better into disruption. Specifically hand traps, it's a lot less vulnerable to. This deck does have flaws. Roland Lockwood, for example, is a huge problem, just like with all the other heavy combo decks, and the Charmies are incredibly oppressive too. But this deck is solid, and it's been a fan favorite for a while because it can steal wins versus any deck, no matter how meta it is. And we've seen players like Kanak, sorry if I ruined that name, but constantly get close to the top cut at a YCS with this deck. Now, I'd love to see if he can break through that barrier and actually get to the top cut, because I love seeing a dedicated player go ham, but I think it kind of proves that Blackwing has some level of potential. So for me, I'm going to place this deck in the B tier alongside Dark Magician as an opposite, where instead of being a control deck like Dark Magician, this is an actual example of a good combo deck. Next up, we've got Shining Sarcophagus, and Shining Sarcophagus is actually a cool one. So this is a deck I've wanted to revisit for a while, and I just haven't got a chance to, but I think this deck can hold its own versus Ryzel rather well. And the reason is pretty interesting. Now, Ryzel can beat continuous spells like Shining Sarcophagus in theory with Detonator, but remember, Shining Sarcophagus has this effect that says it cannot be destroyed by monster effects. So it randomly just solo counters the Ryzel board. And then Gandora is a crazy card. Now, Gandora can be a bit weird because Detonator will protect it from being destroyed, but you have other ways to deal with Detonator, whether it be like the Summon Skull Shining Sarc monster, or just banishing everything else and dealing with that later. I think it could maybe line up a decent matchup, and I'm curious to see how it, tests. As well as the general effect negation of Turn Silence can be good against Malice. And like always, this deck has the ability to play a large amount of non-engine to conform itself to whatever's needed to deal with the meta. So I actually really like this deck right now. And my biggest problem is the same problem I've had for a while with this deck, and that is, I don't know why they made it so inconsistent. This deck needs Shining Sarc to play. It's effectively Toon World for this deck. However, if you look at the ways to get Shining Sarcophagus, you have the gadget, and then you have Future Silence, which gets the gadget, and then you have the Shining Sarc itself. That's 9 copies. Well, that's not the worst. It's like the bare minimum to make a deck playable, and it's sitting at the edge of just not good enough to be like a consistent deck. And I feel like if they just gave it one more consistent support card that gets you Shining Sarcophagus, it would actually be a lot better of a deck. That being said, the way it matches up into decks means that I think it is an A tier deck. I'd love to put it as an S tier deck because I think it may have the makings of one, but that consistency really bogs me down. And 9 is such an awkward number because it's so close but so far from being a threat. Next up, we've got the gods. Syriax is ready for this ranking, but he may not agree with it because I'm gonna rank this deck pretty poorly. And even though I just released a Obelisk the Tormentor video in Mashable, I think it is a lot worse than the TCG, and there's a couple reasons for that. For one, not being able to play a lot of the broken extra deck monsters makes those type of decks worse, the danger type decks, as well as the Slifer deck is worse without Anaconda, really leaving only the Pure God card deck as a viable, method of playing this deck. And the Pure God card deck has some big flaws. While it can definitely rock your opponent's shit and get some stuff in there, its biggest problem is kind of ironic, and that is, like a prophet can read the future thanks to the gods, if you play versus opponents who can read what your cards do and then plan around it, the God deck is one of the easiest to play around. Cards like Soul Crossing are incredibly vulnerable to just a skill check, like your opponent knowing how to play around it, not committing bodies to the field. Same with Sphere Mode. Playing around cards like Breaking Ruin God or Mortal Phoenix that are unaffected. It leaves the deck with several pretty drastic choke points and ways of beating you. And it's not like this deck goes first very well. It kind of has to go second and brute force its way through. And that lends itself even worse off for a deck that's weak to knowledge. I think just all that in mind, this deck belongs in F tier. It's another deck where it's so close to just jumping up drastically in the skill ceiling or in the power ceiling. It's not there. So next up, we've got Heroes, another fan favorite that always sees play, and it's topped like a lot, all things considered. Now, as for right now, how well does it play into the current metagame? Unfortunately, I think it's kind of awkward. For example, Rizal at 3 pops can be kind of overwhelming for Heroes to deal with, especially with the continuous traps like Increase, kind of invalidating Ferris as an extender. And then playing into Malice can be hard because Darklaw does nothing, and the trap cards can bypass Plasma in some cases. Your end field is still pretty good, so it's not like you can't win going first against Malice, but it does kind of make it hard. And then obviously cards like Mali and Denier get way worse into the Malice Whitebinder plays. That being said, Heroes' core engine is leagues above kind of everything we talked about right now. It has high quality extenders and high quality disruptions, and we're getting more of those in Supreme Darkness. And we decided to look at how those affect the deck if they make it go up in the rankings. But for now, I think I'm going to hold it at like an A tier spot because I think it is very strong, but not having particularly favorable matchups means that it can't in good conscience place it higher than an A tier. Next up, we got Sharks, a deck that I made a video on the tier 0 channel, or will be up shortly. I'm not sure exactly when, but it is a deck that I have posted a video about, and it is a very cool deck with brand new support from Rage of the Abyss. I think it's improved a lot. It has the ability to make powerful OTK pushes, make really strong fields, as well as it can be played in like this 1-card combo or 2-card combo sort of fashion. It almost feels like a budget Rizal deck, which is pretty funny, and you can play it alongside Rizal cards too to give it a little more oomph. And obviously in the TCG with Bahamut Shark and Totally Awesome existing, it's even better than it is in alternative formats. Now, all that combined leaves this deck, I think, in a rather good position. You also play a fair bit of non-engine in here, and that helps to compensate for some of your weaker matchups. So for me, I think I put this deck in the S tier section. I think it's the most well-balanced rogue deck we've gone over so far, and fresh off the new support, it makes sense for this to be the highest ranking deck. Next up, we've got Cyber Dragons, a deck which I forgot to go over last time, but you guys all insisted that I talk about. And Cyber Dragon is a deck that to me has been kind of a non-deck for a while. This deck just doesn't do anything. It hasn't received support in a long amount of time, even though now they've announced support for April for us. The key to this deck is it's supposed to be able to go second in OTK, but it does that worse than effectively every other going second deck, including the next deck on this tier list. And you can suck up their cards, their machines, which right now there's none in the meta to suck up, or you suck up their extra monster zone with Mega Fleet Dragon, which doesn't matter in this metagame. So overall, Cyber Dragon is just badly positioned with no new support cards. It's not great at going second. Going first, it's just meh, it's Infinity Pass. So for me, it's just an F tier deck where it's completely outclassed, having not gotten any support in years. Cyber Dragon will get its day once again, but it's not now. And next up is Ancient Gears, a powerful deck that I've looked at a couple times on the channel, and it's one that I feel like has often been overslept on because it plays like Tempai. It goes second and it OTKs with incredible amounts of damage. Now, it is a little more complex than Tempai, and I think that scares people off, as well as it's brickier than Tempai, and that also scares people off. However, the power level of the Ancient Gear cards is really, really, really high. Like, a lot of people don't understand until you read the cards how insane they are. Things like Ancient Gear Fortress read like Sangan Summoning. It's kind of just insane, and unlike Tempai, this deck is not hit. If you're looking for a go second OTK deck that is not Tempai, this does it very well. Now, for me, this deck's biggest weakness is Rizal Detonator. Again, ability to pop continuous spells hurts, so Ancient Gear Fortress and Ancient Gear Advance both being vulnerable is a huge problem. Although I do think this deck has the makings of a one-day meta deck. The other problem is we're missing a card that is legal in Master Duel and OCG, and it's Ancient Gear Statue, which is like Lone Fire Blossom plus Terror Top. It does fall a bit worse than I'd like. However, I still think it is a lot more powerful than people give it credit for, and I'm going to rank it in the A tier section. And that wraps up all the anime decks. Now, there are a couple other anime decks or anime-esque decks that are on this tier list, but I've classified them in other sections because of their overlap. But that being said, let's move on to some of the past meta decks, see how they hold up. And the first one I'm going to talk about is Sprite. So Sprite is a deck that I ranked pretty highly in past tier lists, and I still think I'd rank it pretty highly, as it's just an incredibly generic deck, and anytime new support cards come out that are just generic, like Silo Hat Rabbit, or the new Hugh Bao Abu, whatever it's called, in the next coming set, Team Darkness. No elf does hurt, but that's fine. The deck now has access to Toad, unlike it does in Master Duel and OCG, with the Ice Barrier support, and the Live Twin cards are good. Sprite's just a flexible deck. It's high quality cards, and there's a reason why Power of the Elements revolutionized Yu-Gi-Oh! The cards are just good card quality, and Sprite has way less hits than its counterpart T-Element, meaning that you can play almost an unhit deck, you know, barring like Ronin Toad and Sprite Elf. It's not gonna like have any crazy matchups into the best decks, but I think it's just a good deck overall. I'm not gonna talk about it too much. Put it in the A tier. Next up is T-Element, a deck which came alongside Sprite and was incredibly powerful, best deck of all time, and has been massacred on the ban list as a result. I think this deck is unfortunately kind of like upper B tier, low A tier. I'm gonna put this in B tier for now, and the reason is rather simple. And it's like I talked about on the meta tier list video. Despite its ability to play very powerful cards, you lack the insane power the Master Duel tier has with Snow and Kit, as well as when you go second, you struggle immensely in the cards like Dweller and Whitebinder, which are in like both of the top decks. Its ability to succeed depends a lot on how it matches up into the meta decks, and I think right now it's like worse than it's ever been. Or I guess it's similar to when Cashier is being played and a Rise Heart existed. But like Millennium, it's just circumstances in the metagame leave it as a bad choice. Moving on, we got Rescue Ace. This is a deck that I think low-key just blows. Obviously, with original Simbasball being banned, it's just not a good deck. So where like the Rescue Ace deck can still thrive is resolving Turbulence is very good. And you can push the Turbulence through with cards like SP and with cards like Princess to force the Turbulence to resolve through Impermanence type cards. However, Impermanence still hurts because before you'd want to use original to get the Hydrant, and then Emergency would serve as protection from Veiler and Imperm. Now, like, you have to use the Emergency to play, which is a problem. This deck is kind of existing in the same form that it did back in August 2023, and it did get second at a YCS in Cancun. However, I really feel like power creep has had a lot since then. Every deck, including the decks that existed then, have gotten stronger. Rescue Ace has stayed effectively the same. The Turbulence push is still powerful, but that's really all it has going for it, and it's not a deck I'd recommend playing. Next, we got Snake Eyes, the best deck of the last year, which has been brutally hit on the ban list. Now, with the OSS ban, it's been completely disconnected from its Diabell Star and Wanted and Azamina package. Now, without those bringing it together, the deck is like sorely inconsistent, as well as the payoff for comboing is not that high. So overall, Snake Eye is just, I think, in a terrible spot, and maybe this changes a bit more with the Damned Dragon coming out in the Supreme Darkness, but for now, Snake Eye Ash and its friends, F tier. Thank God. Next up, we got Unchained, one of my favorite decks from the past few metas, and around the same era as Rescue Ace. Now, this deck has seen a little bit of success lately, being thanks to Fiends with cards. Fiends with cards are obviously very good on their own merits, but they're also better in the Unchained deck because they directly support getting into Yama. And Yama is obviously great in other decks like Yubel, but it's even better in Unchained because it gets you actual engine instead of Shavara, which is just like some bonus, but not like a crazy thing. I don't know. Unchained for me is like honestly pretty good. The biggest problem here is Dweller. Whitebinder and the Malice cards, Unchained can kind of play through a decent bit. It's not that bad, as well as you can play non-engine to compensate for some of the deck's weaknesses. And Detonator is not a huge problem for this deck either. So you do have a lot of randomly good matchups into top decks. However, Dweller is still a problem that holds it back. I don't know, maybe I'm being an idiot here, placing this so high. I'll put this in S tier. It's just Fiendsmith cards have been so crazy right now. And the Unchained cards use Fiendsmith very well as it plays well into other things. So yeah. Next up, we got Dragon Link, another powerful deck from the 2022 era. It's very interesting in Master Duel, where slowly every single good Dragon Link card has been released off of the ban list. However, TCG isn't seeing the same level of returns. And even in Mashable, the deck has failed to make a huge impact. It's a playable deck, but it's not broken. Now, I think it's very similar in the TCG in terms of its power level, albeit worse. Some people can mix this alongside Tempai, and that's like fine, but it doesn't actually, I think, make anything meaningful. As well as the banning of Warlord Savage Dragon did hurt this deck's ability to make a powerful end field. So yeah, the deck overall did take a big step down. I'm going to put this in the B tier. Obviously, it has all the makings of a good deck, as it has powerful extenders that can play with favorite non-engine. It's still Dragon Link, and Dragon cards are broken, but it's kind of the worst it's been ever in the TCG. Next up, let's go on to the structure deck section. So I'm looking at the past 6 structure decks that were released, and the first one is going to be the Albaz Strike structure deck, and Branded. So I think Branded is an S tier rogue deck. It's fallen out of favor a lot because people maybe got bored of it, and there have been some hits like Branded Fusion 01 making people drop the deck, and now the Puppet's been banned as well. But I think this deck has no reason to fret, and you can play this deck similar to how you play it in Mashable, and the deck does fine in Mashable. Even if it's not the single top threat, it has consistently been a relevant deck in the Mashable meta for a long time, and it's weird how we haven't seen the same thing happen in the TCG. Now, the deck isn't perfect, and it has obvious weaknesses like stuff to Dimensional Barrier, which is popular in the TCG because of Rizal, but it shouldn't dissuade you too much from playing this deck, because that's kind of always existed, and everything else about the deck is still strong. And even if you can't FTK your opponent with Puppet Lock, Mirror Jade being used over and over and over again is effectively what Malice does, and the Branded deck follow-up is also really good, so it kind of is just the same thing. Also, this deck shouldn't really have a hard time with Detonator, given that popping cards off your field isn't too important. You'll just stray away from cards like Branded Lost, because obviously that's like the only weak point in your deck, the Detonator. So give this deck a try if you haven't. I guess it's good. Weird, right? Next up is Crystal Beast, my deck. Let's go. So I love this deck, and obviously since the last tier list, I did manage to top a YCS with Crystal Beast, which is crazy. However, with the Snake Eyes being hit, it does hurt this deck a lot, as well as Crystal Beast is all continuous spells, like all continuous spells. And guess what? I said destroy continuous spells. Rizal Detonator again. It's a really bad matchup for Crystal Beast, like really, really bad matchup. As well as you can't even play overdrive versions of this deck because Malice will rip apart your grave with White Binder and thus disable your ability to set up Rainbow Dragon. It's like kind of rough out here for Crystal Beast right now. Now, I do think this deck has some promise with the release of Supreme Darkness and Snake Eyes Damn the Dragon, giving a little bit more hope in the Snake Eyes variant, and I'm looking forward to retrying that in the coming weeks. But for now, this deck is really bad. And I'm going to put this in D tier alongside my bad combo deck like Synchron. That's now what it is again. And maybe I should go lower in F tier, but I have faith in Crystal Beasts because we still have Golden Rule, still have Rainbow Bridge of the Heart, which are like custom cards, and yeah, we'll leave it there. Next up is Dark World, a deck which I've seen people talk about nonstop in the comment section of my video as being a good deck. And I don't know why Dark World fans keep talking about Dark World in my videos that have nothing to do about Dark World. Most dedicated player base of toxic deck, because this deck is toxic. Who likes this deck? Who likes hand rip FTK nonsense? God, like, why is this a fan favorite deck? I don't get it. I really don't get it. I don't like this deck. And in terms of playability, it also sucks. It's weak to Droll and Shifter, cards that are popular in the metagame. It's weak to Dweller, it's weak to White Binder. It doesn't make sense to play this in the current metagame. As well as with Genta and Dark World, Gates of the Dark World being some of the most powerful ways to push in this deck. Those are weak to Detonator. Again, you really can't catch a break against Detonator. Very few decks can. Dark World is no exception. Bestials are very popular right now as well. And Dark World struggles versus Bestials. This is a D tier deck at best. Because when it pops off, it is kind of insane, but still, like, this is not a good deck. Guys, come on. Next up is Trap Tricks. And Trap Tricks is another fan favorite deck that I never got the hype for. Now, I always thought this deck really sucked going second, and I think that hasn't changed. So for me, that always will hold this deck back. When he goes first, it is really good going first. It can win most grind games, as well as it sets up an almost endless amount of disruption. It can play an okay amount of non-engine, although not as much as I'd like. It's an okay deck. For me, this is a C tier deck, B tier deck maybe, in the middle areas, because it has some strengths. It doesn't have crazy glaring weaknesses, but it's also just not very strong. Next up, we've got the Red Dragon Archerfiend deck, or Resonator deck. Another structure deck / anime deck that was pretty popular in Mashable for a fair bit, but never took off in the TCG. Now, this deck is honestly not as bad as I thought it was, but having played against it more in Mashable, I see its merit. It has some powerful combos, and a lot of them don't require that many cards to actually pop off, as well as it can be really awkward to clear and in a grind game, making it not that bad. and you can fit in a decent number of non-engine because its combos are rather self-contained. That being said, it is weak to disruption. It's not particularly crazy in its power level. It's not bad, but it's not like broken. So for me, this is like a C tier level deck where it can hold its own, kind of well-rounded, but it's not going to break the barriers into anything. As well as Detonator obviously will ruin this deck. Like, yeah, you're going to lose Rizal Detonator, but that's the kind of the problem with every deck that's not at the top of this tier list. Next up, we've got Fire Kings. And Fire King is a deck that recently got murdered on the ban list thanks to the original Simple Spawn being banned. And it was already in a bad spot in the metagame because of cards like Dweller and Whitebinder. Once again, graveyard removal really making it hard for a lot of these decks to function. However, unlike Rescue Ace, where it lost all its ability to extend, I think alternative engines can still be played alongside Fire King, and I'm currently working on a deck to showcase to you guys that uses Fire King and should still be somewhat playable using the Kashtira cards into the Raid Raptor rank 7. And having that level 7 synergy also means you can still play Diabellstar. It's obviously going to struggle into the meta, but versus every other non-Rise or Malice deck, it should have a really good matchup actually, and I think that leaves it in an okay spot. For me, it's like a bottom of A tier, top of B tier type of thing. It has a lot of potential, but it is held back by its circumstances a lot. Okay, that wraps up the structure decks. So if you're going to play a structure deck, I think the one to be whipping out is, of course, Branded. However, Fire King is still a fine example. Now, the next thing to go over are the TCG exclusive archetypes. And first up, we got Mimighoul, a deck which I think is incredibly cool. It has an extremely unique identity, and I love when Konami makes decks that are unlike anything else that existed. I haven't seen people talk about it lately, and the hype is kind of worn or died down, but this deck, I think, is actually in the making of an S tier deck. Now, why? Does it pair up specifically well into Rizal or Malice? No, I don't think it's particularly weak into either of those either, though, which is an important thing. What I do think is good, however, is the deck can play a lot of different non-engine, as well as the deck is an extremely unique mechanic, which can be exploited by many different things, as well as it's incredibly flexible. Nothing locks you into anything from Mimighouls. You can play it in many different decks. Using Kashtira Fiendsmith is what I used, and in my Mermail video, you'll remember I played against a Mech Knight Mimighoul player, which kind of shows the level of innovation that is left to be seen with Mimighoul, because the mechanic that nothing else in the game can kind of use, Mimighoul can, giving your opponent monsters, and then not just having a downside on that, but a good thing come out of it. And if there's a rogue deck to play from this whole list that I want to recommend, I'm going to recommend Mimighoul. Next up, we're moving on to Ashen, the previous TCG exclusive deck, which I also reviewed on the channel, and it was all right. It had some things going for it, but it also had some crazy choke points, as well as it wasn't a fast-paced deck, and it was just meh as far as control goes. I don't know if my opinions have changed on it very much, but it really just can't hold up, and it gets worse and worse as power creep happens, as there's been nothing to bolster Ashen's playability. So for me, this is just a C tier deck. I see no real reason to play this over anything else. It's a cool deck, and I'm happy Konami made it. I wish they made it a little better, but yeah. Moving on, we got Plunder Patrol, another classic deck that I've not seen much play lately, which is a bit of a shame because this deck is really awesome, and it can also do a lot of things where other decks can't. This is another example of the TCG designers like Jerome just cooking and making something that has a very individual identity, something that's not copied by anything else. So I'd love to see more support come for Plunder to push it back into the metagame or push it closer into the metagame. But for now, I think this deck is still fine. The reasons for Plunder being good is an incredible grind game, as well as having solid disruptions, and that still exists, as well as you can play supplementary engines that can be good into the metagame, such as Runic Engine or Adventure cards. Now, both of those specifically aren't the best right now. That does leave Plunder in a bit of an awkward position, but overall, I still think it is a good deck. For me, this is a B tier deck, but it's also like a higher B tier deck. It could also be A tier. It's just, for me, sometimes it can be a bit slow to get going with Plunder, and that's the biggest problem, as well as there's some counterplay on the opponents that can really mess you up, given that the attributes can be such a crucial piece of the deck. Next, we got Beat Trooper, and Beat Trooper is a cool one because Beat Trooper has gotten some new support, even if not directly, in Rage of the Abyss and other sets. Splitting Planarian, the Battle Wasp cards, all just serve to give this deck more starters and extenders. However, the problem with this deck is the same as the Reptile deck, and it still stands, and that's you have nothing to sort of make with your bodies. You can spam bodies really effectively now, but it doesn't go anywhere. It can play grind games well because you have an endless sort of follow-up, and your end field isn't a nothing, but it's not good. It kind of reminds me of Resonator sort of stuff, albeit in an entirely different package. For me, it's a C tier deck, and I really hope they get something just push it over the edge because it's close. This and Reptiles, they're so close. Speaking of Reptiles, let's talk about Mitsurugi, which will be coming out in the new set. And I guess I haven't really talked about Supreme Darkness or I haven't ranked cards as if Supreme Darkness was out in the new set, but I figured now is the perfect chance to give you guys my first impression of these cards. And I think this is an S tier deck. Like, I think Mitsurugi cards are crazy. If you aren't familiar with those, go read them. I have them on screen here, but they were revealed for us a little bit ago. Why they're so insane is Snake Rain is a broken card for one. King of Feral Imps is a broken card, and it synergizes well with Rizal or the Ogdoadic cards. Ogdoadic specifically, its biggest weakness in all the Reptile cards was they didn't have a good way to end on anything. And the Mitsurugi cards act as good disruptions, able to rip your opponent's hand, get their field, end on negates, as well as be good follow-up. It's exactly what you want for endboard pieces. They're actually just so powerful, and I wouldn't be surprised if this becomes an actual tier threat in the metagames. Mitsurugis have my seal of approval. I'm very excited to play them in the upcoming weeks. And lastly, for TCG exclusive archetypes, we got Goaty, the fish deck, a deck which I think is really bad. I'm sorry, guys. I know this is another fan favorite deck, but this is like a D tier deck for me, maybe even F tier. Like, the plays are just like boneless Fire King or tier, where it plays on your opponent's turn, but in an incredibly vulnerable fashion. No, I'm gonna put this in F tier. This deck's not good. I'm sorry, guys. Now, the last segment of the tier list is the decks that have gotten support or brand new decks that I haven't yet talked about. And the first one is Yugioh, which I've not mentioned in the tier list in the past because it is clearly worse than Malice and Rizal. If you want to see me take on this deck, check out the Tier 0 channel. I'll be releasing it in the future. I am working on it there as well. But this deck is not bad. If you guys haven't read the field spell for this deck, it is custom. It searches a dinosaur, a sea serpent, and a wing beast. It's crazy. Now, obviously, there are many things holding this deck back from meta viability, but I have faith. So for me, this is like a high B tier, low A tier deck. It has cool combos, it's consistent, and it has a lot of things going for it. However, it is definitely not a meta threat. It has a lot of weaknesses as well. It requires multi-card combos, which obviously is bad in a high power level format where you want non-engine. So yeah, B tier it is. Next up, we've got Six Samurais, which got brand new support in Rage of the Abyss. And this deck's power level is pretty high. If you watched Team Sam's video, you can do some crazy things, including deck your opponent out when you get Mulch Armied, which is great for a deck that, you know, can get FTK'd by a Max D-type card. And Six Samurai's combos are not bad either. You can end on multi-negates pretty easily, and it's consistent. Biggest problem with it is it's very weak to removal, which means while going first is fine, going second into a board is like impossible. And that's always been the biggest thing holding back a lot of synchro decks, Six Samurai being no exception. And for me, that means it can't move any higher than B tier, where it has its upsides, and upsides are big upsides, but it can't go beyond. Lastly, we've got Dragon Rulers, which have not got any support yet, although it has been announced through April. And it has got is all the Dragon Rulers back at 3 off the ban list. How does this deck hold up? It's another deck that I will be showing on the channel at some points in the near future. It is okay. The thing is, without Master Duel having like cards like Tomahawk and Waradon, your ability to make powerful endfields is actually a lot worse. Rank 7s kind of just suck, as well as the Dragon Rulers are good at grind games, but you don't go to grind games like you do in old Yu-Gi-Oh! So where this deck actually sees success is that it's a toolbox for Tenpai, and rank 7s can be good at forcing through the field with cards like Dracosac. That's really all it is. It's like a half-baked Tenpai deck. And for me, that's like not a bad thing, but that means it's just B tier bait is what we'll call it, because that's really what it is. It's just Tenpai. it's just a Tenpai deck. But that's it. That's what I have for the tier list, guys, and these are the official rankings for my Rogue tier list. Let me know if there's anything else that I missed, or for any rankings that you disagree with. In the future, if I do these tier lists and anytime we have an off season, then if there's any categories you want to see me include more of or less of, or include period, then let me know, because these are a great way to show you guys different ways of playing the game that don't involve try-harding into the same meta nonsense every time. With that said, I'll see you guys all next time. Peace.